Welcome to You Are From God, where we open the Bible and learn to see the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? You ever heard that one, Scott?
No.
No? Never seen that commercial? Man,
Yes.
I don't know when that was out, but obviously that's a old ad campaign for the Tootsie Roll Pops or the suckers with that chocolate center, and the whole thing was, how many licks does it take to get to that chocolate center? I don't know if that's a saying of the chocolate's better than the candy on the outside.
That's right.
Yeah.
The world will never know.
Yeah, the world may never know. But I was thinking about that this week, and kind of ties into our topic today. I was actually reading this fascinating book all about wolves, lots of different species of wolves, but it was talking about this in this one part of the book. The Inuit people of the North will go wolf hunting. Then, wolves aren't their primary target as far as meat sources, but if that's what's around, they'll hunt wolves. And the way that they do it is fascinating because obviously wolves are trained killers. They grow and they have been designed to take down huge animals. But for the Inuit people, they will be a little more subtle in their hunting. What they'll do, as it was described in this book, is they'll take a knife and they'll coat it in either blood of another animal or the fat of another animal, and they'll let it freeze so it's solid and the knife is encased in blood or fat, and then they're going to stick it with a blade encased in this stuff sitting straight up out in the snow, and they'll leave it, and it's a trap. So a wolf comes along and they smell the blood or the fat, and so obviously that's a sign to them that there's food around, and they stumble upon this little chunk of frozen food, and they start licking it. They realize, hey, this is food. This is like food I've eaten my whole life. So they start looking at the fat or the blood, and they just keep licking and licking and licking, and eventually they're licking so much that it melts the outside layer and it gets to the knife, and it cuts their tongue. Now, normally, if that would happen to us, we would think, whoa, we need to stop. Something's not right here. The wolf, obviously it's cold out, so there's a numbing factor to this, but there's also the sense of when the wolf tastes blood, that's what they're used to eating. They taste blood all the time. And so they taste the blood, and maybe it's a little warmer now, and say, oh, wow, I'm getting to the good part. So instead of stopping, they keep licking, and they keep cutting themselves. And instead of stopping and letting their tongues heal, like God's designed our tongues and mouths to heal pretty quickly, they just keep licking and licking. What happens is the wolf bleeds to death. Now, I'm sorry if you're eating breakfast or something and you weren't expecting this story, but there's a purpose behind all this, right? The story, I think, is fascinating to talk about the idea of Satan's way of distracting us. When we talk about the idea that we are made in the image of God and we chase after things that we are not made to fulfill ourselves by, to build our lives around, to pursue, it's like we're this wolf, and Satan has set out this thing that looks good. It might feel like or seem like the right thing, and we start licking or engaging in that activity, if you will, and it seems fine. And eventually, there's a cut. The question we want to ask today, Scott, is how many licks does it take for us to realize what's happening? Or do we ever realize it to the point of we're in Satan's trap? The Bible will talk about it as his snare that he's caught us in. We need to wake up and realize that this is his way of trapping us and getting us to spiritually bleed out.
It's amazing how often you can see physical examples of how these things happen, and we can read them and think about them and talk about them and almost even joke about how can that wolf continue to lick that, or how could that possibly happen, when the reality is, to your point, we do this all the time. It's the danger for us to not understand the enemy that we have, and to just allow him to deceive us and to continue to do the things that we find temporary fulfillment in, rather than understanding what the big picture is. And in John the 8th chapter, there's so many different verses, and we'll look obviously at some of them, but that talk about our enemy, the devil, and what he is and what he has done. And the amazing thing in John the 8th chapter, Tyler, is that you're dealing with people that thought they were religious, and they're getting on Jesus, talking to him, testing him, having a conversation with him. And he tells him in verse 44, you are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Jesus couldn't be any clearer on
Yeah.
what he's talking about here. He makes it very clear. You guys think that you're religious. You think that you're the father. Your father is Abraham, is what they'll talk about here. Ultimately trying to say that they're of God's children. But the reality is what they didn't understand was they're actually like their father, the devil. The dangerous part, Tyler, is how often we can fall into that just as quickly. We fall into the lies, the deception, and thinking that we are like our Father, God, when the reality is we are very much like Satan. We are following Satan and doing the things that he is wanting us to do. That's the dangerous part of not truly understanding our enemy. You think about 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, verses 1 through 6, and he gets into these conversations about who this looks like, what this one that is our enemy looks like, what he's able to do, and the importance of us growing and being the people that we have been called to be. And he tells them, I'll just read verses 12 through 14. The whole chapter really is good for this. But in verse 12, he says, "But what I am doing, I will continue to do, so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the matter about which they are boasting. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light." So you think about the one that we are talking about here. He can disguise himself as things that look good. Then he can tempt us by things that sometimes that can look good or have this temporary pleasure to them. And the reality is what we are doing is what you were talking about earlier with the illustration is you're just licking a knife. You're killing yourself. And the dangerous piece of that is you're spiritually dead and don't even know it. That's the danger when we're talking about, first of all, how powerful our enemy is and how we have no opportunity to have a relationship with God, to be with God for eternity. Without God, we're going to be defeated by the enemy. But with him, he has no shot. The dangerous part is us being so blinded to the reality of the situation that we find ourselves to be in.
Yeah, and that's a good way of explaining it, right? The wolf, in a sense, in that illustration is blinded by hunger or whatever it might be. We're blinded by, again, whatever our desires or appetites might be, that we're not taking the time to stop and think about God's purposes and God's will. And I might be being fooled. I might be getting the wool pulled over my eyes here. You know, earlier in this same chapter of 2 Corinthians 11, Paul references Satan a little bit earlier when in verse 2 he says, "For I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ." And if that's not what Satan absolutely wants, he's wanting to lead us astray from that sincere and pure devotion to Christ. He's fine if there's a little bit of Jesus. It's the sincere and pure devotion where he's lost. So anything to distract us, to get our minds focused and to get us fixated on fulfilling ourselves in some other way, Jesus can be part of the picture, but as long as he's not the center, as long as he's not the Lord over everything, Satan's won. Earlier in this book, in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul keeps reminding them that Satan is at work among them. And again, this is the second letter that he's writing. And so this is kind of following up in this part of something he's written in the first letter where they've pointed out that somebody's in sin, that they've marked that person, that they have, again, disciplined them as the Lord has spelled out as far as disfellowshipping. And now Paul's saying, all right, listen, he's repentant. He's come back. You need to embrace him. He's your brother. This is the way that God's made it. In verse 10 of 2 Corinthians 2, Paul says, "Anyone whom you forgive, I also forgive. Indeed, what I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, has been for your sake in the presence of Christ, so that we would not be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his designs." So obviously Paul here is talking about a mature understanding of Satan wants division. Satan wants people to be lost in sin. Satan wants there to be this animosity and even hesitancy when it comes to reconciliation and bringing somebody back into the fold of God, for there to still to be that rift there. That's what Satan desires. So Paul says we need to make sure that we're not outwitted by him, that we're not ignorant of how he's going to do these things, of his design. The question and the concern here is, Scott, again, is maybe we are outwitted by him. Maybe we are ignorant of his designs because we keep going back to this knife in the snow. How many licks do we think are safe until the knife is going to cut us? And when it does, do we take the time to stop and realize that And in the spiritual aspect, repent, turn away from that, go back to the fountain of living waters, the Lord who is giving us everything we need and more. Or are we going to say, I can keep licking this and I'll be fine, whether we realize what's happening spiritually to us or not? The whole idea here is us taking a step back and seeing with spiritual eyes, having the eyes of our heart enlightened, as Paul will say in other places, to understand what's really happening, seeing Satan's role in it, certainly, as we've been talking, but understanding what we are meant for and the role that we are meant to have, and truly seeing those things constantly, working to see those things each and every day.
You know, you think about the scriptures where it talks about him looking for the weaker and as a lion seeking whom to devour in Peter. And it's amazing how often we think that the weaker is just going to be so obvious, that we're not going to be the weaker one. We're the one that thinks we're okay. Well, sometimes we're the gazelle that thinks we're so strong that we can go off by ourselves, and there's a lion. And understanding the weakness that comes with that and the danger that comes with that, if we're not drawing near to God, surrounding ourselves with God's people, reading his word, praying, all the things that we talk about that we need to be doing that strengthens this relationship and makes sure that we're not ignorant of his schemes. We need to make sure that we are doing. I think of Acts, the 26th chapter, where Paul is before Agrippa, and Paul, whenever he gives a defense, really what it comes down to, he gives his, what we call a testimony. He tells really the story of him meeting Jesus. And it's amazing how he'll talk about this. He'll talk about Jesus. I'm Jesus whom you persecuting in verse 15. He'll go through what he wants him to do, go to the Gentiles. And then picking up in verse 18, he says, to open their eyes, talking of the Gentiles and the Jews, obviously, as the chapters go on. But here, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive the forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. So it was to open their eyes. And for us, it's the same thing. We need to open our eyes. We need to be honest. You know, in 2 Corinthians, it talks about you need to test yourselves. Well, the easiest person many times for us to fool is ourselves. You can test yourself solely if you're willing to open your eyes. Are we licking the knife, as you're talking about? Are we doing the things that we can do to stay away from Satan? Or are we trying to get so close to the lion, not God, to the lion Satan, that we're not allowing ourselves, or we're allowing ourselves to be taken by him and not even know it? As 2 Timothy talks about the snare of the devil, they don't even know they're in the snare. And that's the danger for us. We need to open our eyes. We need to understand how powerful our enemy is, but we can never forget how powerful our God is. And that's the key for all of this, is to understand, in essence, which lion are we going to follow? Are we going to be devoured by the evil one, or are we going to be protected by the great lion, the one who created all things and the one who's going to come back and take us home to be with him if we're living for him? But we need to make sure that our eyes are open.
Yeah, that Lion of Judah that the scriptures talk about, the one that John is told that, you know, the lion is coming and he sees the lamb. This is the one that the only way we're going to see clearly what those knives in the snow are for what they are. Even again, they look so good. They're so appealing. Satan knows what he's doing.
Absolutely.
And so no wonder then in Ephesians chapter 6, we'll end with this passage. Paul will encourage, as he's ending this letter to this church, to find that strength in the Lion of Judah, to be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. That's verse 10. Ephesians 6:11 continues, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Look, Scott, I sometimes I read the Bible and I know that things are there and I read them. This is one of those places that I call a peek behind the curtain. Like, there's just so much more than what I can even comprehend going on.
Right.
And that can be overwhelming, right? The idea that there's cosmic forces, there's the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Certainly that's part of the schemes of the devil that verse 11 is talking about. And I might not understand all that, but the fact is this goes on and makes it clear what our role is. We take up the whole armor of God in verse 13, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. He goes on and just keeps saying stand. You put on these armor pieces, the helmet, the breastplate, the sword, the shield, the shoes, all of this is ultimately reflecting the character that we are to have found in God. Going back to verse 10, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. That's how we open our eyes. That's how we say no to those knives in the snow. That's how we avoid those things. And listen, we're going to be tricked. Satan is an expert at these things, and he wants nothing more than to corrupt the image of God in us. And so he leads us astray and he tricks us. When that happens, when we start realizing that our tongues are being cut spiritually, we need to have the wherewithal and the awareness to stop, to realize what's happening. Our tongues will heal, again, spiritually speaking, and we can turn back and get back to standing firm in the Lord, to know that I was fooled once, I'm not going to go down that road again. And the fact that our God is gracious and merciful and invites us back when we have turned away to go to those other things just shows that he is so patient and merciful and loving, that we have an awesome God that we are called to live for, because he has made us in his image and we are from God. Thanks for listening. Show your support by leaving a review on your podcast app, and share this episode with someone you want to encourage. If you have questions or would like to get in touch with us, go to youarefromgod.com. That's youarefromgod.com.